So today I will talk about my recent work on temporal network motifs, models, limitations, and evaluation. This is something we finished during the summer with my PhD student, Peng Hang Liu, and visiting master student, Valeria Guaresi. So to begin with, the network motifs, if you heard about that, are pretty useful structures that have been used to analyze real-world networks. Formally, they are defined as recurrent and statistically significant subgraphs. Recurrent means they occur very frequently, and statistically significant basically implied by comparison against some random graph models. But what happens is usually you have like a few nodes and edges. The idea is discover some super edge structure, something larger than a node or edge, which is like a trivial building block of the graph. So can we find those subgraphs with a few nodes and edges and characterize the structure of the graph or the processes on the network with respect to those things? So I just put a few examples here. On a directed graph, you can have triangles. In this work, we just focused on small subgraphs. As I said, it is only a few nodes edges. I think another, of course, reason is the computational cost. So I have seen studies doing at most 6 nodes, for instance, but it's kind of harder to go beyond that. And one of the important things is those subgraphs motifs are more meaningful when they are induced. I will talk more about that in the temporal network discussion, but these things are called graphlets. The idea is when you have a set of nodes, you have to consider all the edges among them. So in a sense, you care about the lack of an edge as well as the presence of an edge. So this has been a versatile tool for network analysis. People have used network motifs to analyze food webs. I think the initial Nature paper has that motivation, finding out those feed-forward loops in the neural networks and some interesting acyclic structures in the food webs that can tell us about the structure of different food web networks. The nice thing is those things are extendable for different types of networks. In a bipartite graph, for instance, you have this 2x2 biclic, which we called in the past as the butterfly, thanks to kids of one of my colleagues. And also you can define the weight or consider like multi-layer networks where edges have multiple labels, etc. And those things are not only useful on their own, but also can be used like as a sub-procedure for meso and macro scale analysis. What I mean is, instead of using the classical node degree feature, for instance, one can come up with the motif degree thing. So define the local counts for each node and edge, the number of motifs that include a particular node, and building on these motif degree concepts, you can do things like community detection, or think about more summarizing brief summaries like the motif degree distributions, etc. So there are so many different things you can do by using this fundamental building block network motifs and the motif degrees around nodes and edges. So having said that, I also want to briefly introduce what is the temporal network is. So there are like, this is something very important, and more I read, more I realize that how the confusion can happen happens actually across different CS fields. So in this scope of this work, we define a temporal network as something where links are active only at certain points in time. So we are only caring about the offline computations. So temporal networks are also appearing in the streaming setup. So edges are coming one after another. But in this work, we just consider like the offline computation. We know which edge appears at what time. In the simplest way, this can be characterized as each link, or as we call event or interaction, as a timestamp. So we consider some kind of a timeline, as very nicely shown in this figure. And during that timeline, pairs of nodes are interacting with each other. They can interact again, those repetitions are possible. There is no basically constraint on how they can interact with each other. And the simplest way to look at that thing is put a timestamp attribute for each event. This is a big shift from the classical conventional static network literature. So temporality is pretty important. And this is, of course, not the first time temporal data has been considered. Time series analysis, the research on that is very mature. People have been working on time series for decades. But the hard thing is to combine this graph structure with the temporality. So in the past, there have been some attempts like those snapshot-based analysis. People have defined certain time intervals and considered the edges that fall under that interval and look at the entire temporal network as like a series of snapshots. So for instance, in the figure, they show it, by the way, I hope you can see my cursor. If the snapshot size is defined as T3, for instance, there are 4 snapshots, and the series of snapshots are like this. So temporal networks are hard to process or make sense of it. And one of the reasons that we have observed so far is the structural sparsity, which is the most remarkable characteristic of the real-world networks, where the number of edges being way less than the number of vertex choose to. That means there will be a lot of zeros in your edges and symmetrics representation. This structural sparsity meets with the temporal sparsity in the case of temporal networks. So that basically means it is not like each node is participating in a series of events in a continuous way. So because of that, for most of the temporal networks, we don't observe a clear rhythm. So we don't understand in what sense the things are happening. And also one of the big reasons for this is the burst nature of the human behavior. I will show most of the networks we have been dealing with are considering humans and the interactions among humans. And this burst nature of the human behavior, like doing things one after another in a short period of time and then not doing anything for a long time, is kind of the characteristic in many of the things that we do consciously or unconsciously. That results in this temporal sparsity behavior in the temporal networks. And the nice thing about the motifs in the context of temporal networks is motifs focus on these local small structures and can be effective to capture this fine-grained information, which is otherwise lost in this snapshot-based analysis. So that's why we believe the use of motifs is kind of promising in the context of temporal networks. So there are a lot of challenges temporality brings for the motif analysis, and one of the things that you need to consider is there are multiple things. I just listed a few here, and I will try to make a better sense of that during this talk. But you need to, for instance, consider the multiple interactions between a pair of nodes. Most of the studies in network science graph mining are done for a simple network, undirected, unweighted. To a pair of nodes can be connected just once. You don't allow multiple edges. So in a temporal network, as I said, events are active only at certain points in time. So you have to consider those multiple interactions. If you're making phone calls, the information that I called the person today and I will call him tomorrow is important. So I can't ignore either of those. The other thing is the ordering among the events. Even thinking I will show an example, but in the context of a triangle or a cycle, in what order the things are happening has a lot of value. So most of the time, people are trying to come up with some cause and effect relationships. We also tried that here. But how can you incorporate this ordering among the events in a motif is a very important thing. Yet another thing is about the time difference. So it is not only about one event coming after another, but we know exactly at what time a certain event happens. So that basically tells us putting some kind of a threshold to bound things. For instance, if one event comes after another, how do we say that they are related? So we will define, it has been defined, and we will use the same thing, some kind of a threshold. So we will limit the time difference between two consecutive events to be considered related to each other, and or to be considered in the same motif. So there is an alternative approach which considers the entire time span by looking at the difference between the last event and the first event for that motif. Last but not least, there are those event durations. It's not like all the temporal networks, all the interactions in the temporal networks are instantaneous. Some are instantaneous, like if you send a text message or if you send an email, but some other have duration. So they are more like engagements. You call a person at a particular time, speak for 5 minutes, and that 5 minutes is an important information that we want to keep and utilize in our motif models. And beyond phone calls, there are so many other things that you can think of the engagement. People buy stocks, for instance, keep them for a while and then sell. That kind of things are all denoted with the event durations. So all of those things basically makes the spectrum of motifs in temporal network as significantly larger than the static counterparts. Here, even if you just consider like directed edges and the ordering among them, ordering between the events in a single motif, and you let them you let them repeat among the same pair of nodes. In the static case, you just have two possibilities. One is a cycle, the one on the right. The other is an acyclic motif. But in the temporal sense, you have like 36 possibilities if you limit yourself to 3 nodes and 3 edges. So those are basically the number of things you can have in the temporal context. And the numbers here show the ordering of the edges. That for this one, 1, 3, 2 means the yellow node interacts to or sends something to the red one first, and then blue sends something to red second, and then yellow sends something to red third. So those are this is the way we denote the temporal motifs. So overall, the spectrum is pretty large, and it is kind of unclear how to deal with this explosion of the parameters in a systematic way. And this is basically the subject of this talk and the survey, like the work we have done. So how to consider temporal aspects in network motifs. There have been studies, and we investigate those, compare the motif models by previous works for temporal networks. One of the interesting things was those works coming not only from computer science, but also from the network science physicists and some bio people. So this is like a cross-discipline subject, which also speaks to the large application space of the temporal networks and the temporal motifs. But we basically wanted to unify those things, those independent studies that are unaware of each other. And as you have probably seen a lot of times, the very same thing has different names in different disciplines. So we try to kind of unify those approaches here. So we will consider those comparison of the different previous works with respect to the various aspects of temporality that I mentioned, a few of them, like the event durations or the time difference things, etc. And I will present some ideas for unifying things a little bit. In the second part, I'm going to introduce a comprehensive evaluation. So one of the things that we wanted to make sure is the assumptions brought by a particular model in the literature, does it bring any kind of biases in the motif counts? For instance, for that 36 different things in the 3-node 3-edge space, maybe certain assumptions amplify some motifs and mask some others just because of the things that people have defined. So this is like the first thing we check in the evaluation. We explore this large parameter space, timing parameters, inducedness considerations, etc. And we use like various real-world networks. and also have like a few ideas for how to simplify the representation and making things easier to talk about those things, given this large parameter space. The paper is available here. I will post the link maybe at the end. I can do it now, maybe to chat box so that you can see that. So this is also my outline for the talk. So to begin with, I want to introduce those temporal motif models in the literature. That, to the best of our knowledge, there were four, and the entire research is basically starting with this Cohen and et al.'s paper, and they introduced the temporal motif idea for the first time and introduced this temporal adjacency idea to relate the events in a motif. But the most important thing is how we define the temporal connectivity for the nodes or the edges. And this was published in some, I guess, physics journal where network scientists, statistical physicists are more engaged with. The second paper is from a database community. So in that paper, Song et al. Introduced another model, but the main consideration for this work was streaming workloads, where the motifs are found on the fly. And some of the approaches, design choices are significantly affected when you think about the online situation instead of offline. But one of the novel things in that paper was they consider this partial ordering. So they don't have to put a total ordering among all the events in a motif, but they let some of those undefined, which is more flexible and can be more expressive as well. In the third paper, this Holowati et al., it was from a bioinformatics journal, and they considered this brain networks and introduced the human aging as the application. This was building more on the first paper, and they basically played with the relaxations and the restrictions on top of the Cohen and et al.'s model, and also for the first time discussed this events with durations. And the last paper is the most recent one from Prof et al. This was from Stanford, and they proposed a practical model with a specified time window to bound the motifs, but unaware of the second and third works here, for instance. So it was not a complete coverage of the literature. So to compare those, we came up with a table like this. In the leftmost column, I'm basically listing different temporal aspects that need to be considered when you define your model, and we summarized here how each paper approaches this. So I'm going to talk about the induced subgraph considerations and the timing adjacent events and entire motif in delta C, delta W things. So I'm keeping them for later, but I just want to briefly discuss what these others mean. So the node edge labels or the directed edges, as you imagine, basically discusses what if your edges are directed instead of being undirected in the network, and I think 3 of the 4 models already considered that. So the node labels or the edge labels, both in the categorical and the numeric sense, are only considered in the second work. The partial ordering constraints, again, as I said, is considered in the second and also partly in the first one. And for the event iterations, only the third work proposed something. So for the induced subgraph, I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but the different approaches by different models are mostly because of the complexity of the problem, not because just incorporating this thing as a yes or no answer. That's why I wrote like a node-based temporal for the first and the static only for the third and fourth. So basically, I will talk about this induced subgraph and the timing constraints only, and then switch to the experiments. But we discuss each of those in detail in the paper if you want to check.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
What exactly is a model?
Model is basically how you define the connection connections or the timing constraints between the nodes and events in your network motif, in this case, a temporal motif.
So does that mean a model for determining if something is statistically significant, or an algorithm for extracting things and then you just assume they're statistically significant?
That is more like the second one. I will mention that at the end, the statistical significance is usually measured by comparing with respect to those null models. And one of the big challenges for temporal networks are there's no clear null model for which you can compare with. And this is one of the reasons actually why people considered certain things in different ways and thought that this will be a more realistic thing if we restrict nodes and events to be connected in this way instead of the another.
Okay, thanks.
So this induced subgraph discussion is one thing we have been trying to figure out how it can be modeled, how it can be described in the best way. So in the static case, the interpretation is if you have a subgraph of nodes, you have to consider all the edges among them. That's how they become an induced subgraph. As an example, if you have this network and this motif, then that ABCD is a valid instance of this motif, but CDEF is not, because CF is an edge, and this motif basically asks for the lack of these diagonal edges. And in this case, we have a diagonal edge, so we don't accept CDF as a valid instance of the square motif here. So this is the static interpretation. It's kind of easy to make sense. But in the temporal sense, it's a bit hard because you have this limitation for the motif number of nodes and the number of edges, how many of them you allow, and including everything that have been occurring among those nodes in a specific time interval cannot work if there are more edges happening than the limit you impose. So there are some workarounds brought by those works. To summarize them briefly, in the Kovanen et al.'s paper, they discussed something called this consecutive events restriction, which is more like a node-based temporal inducedness. So the idea is if you have a network and if you want to look for a particular motif, you should make sure that the adjacent events of a node must be consecutive in the network. So I think this example summarizes well. If you have that network, each edge has this timestamp attribute. This edge is happening at the third timestamp. And if you're looking for a motif of 3 nodes, 2 events, like this should happen before this one, then this 3 seconds and 5 seconds event, this will be a valid instance. But that 3 seconds and 8 seconds will be not, because you ignore this other thing that is adjacent to the middle node. And in their opinion, this is not good if you consider the events that are adjacent to a node. You should include all of them that are consecutive in time. But that was the idea. And they have, this is basically an approach based on intuition, not based on something more theoretical. In the second work, they explicitly disallowed this induced subgraph definition, and this is more about the way they compute things. As I said, they are doing this on-the-fly computation, and there's no way for you to know if that diagonal edge will be coming in the next hour or next day. So you have to be able to report whatever you find at that moment. If you determine there's a cycle, then just say it. It doesn't matter if it will be a fork-leak in the future. And if you think about the applications, especially fraud detection used by the banks and the financial institutions, this makes a lot of sense. This squaring, the fourth cycle, for instance, is one of the best indicators of fraud, and especially for the global payments. And we are working with JP Morgan, for instance, and they are looking for these online fraud detection methods based on the temporal motives. And the inducedness is something they totally don't care about. And they have a point here. The third paper had some other approach, but they call it constraint dynamic reflect. And it was more about the way they modeled the temporal network. They considered the temporal network as a series of snapshots, and the constraint dynamic reflect is basically enforcing the repeated interaction in two consecutive snapshots to be not considered. So the idea is you don't introduce any new information, so better to not consider this repeated thing, which will also avoid redundant computation. In the last paper, they just considered the inducedness in the static projection. Static projection means you just consider the aggregation of the entire temporal network. You ignore the timestamps on the edges. So for the timing constraints, there are well-defined two approaches, which makes sense. One is about the time difference between the consecutive pair of events, and the other is about bounding the entire motif. So we call those delta C and delta W. The delta C is formally the time difference between the consecutive pair of events. So this is something independent of the motif size and aimed to capture more like the causality or the relevance relations. They want to make sure two consecutive events are not happening too far in the timeline. Like as an example again, if you assume the delta C is equal to 6 seconds, the triangle here is a valid thing because 9 minus 3 is 6 and the 15 minus 9 is less than or equal to 6. But the one on the left is not, because you let 8 seconds between the first and the second events. So that is the idea. The other approach is the delta W, where time difference is brought as the difference between the last and the first events. So you are looking for a more holistic view. You don't care about the exact consecutive differences, but look at the entire thing. And again, if you assume that the W is equal to 10 seconds, the one on the left is not big enough, not small enough for this. It's like a 12 seconds, and it doesn't work. And two of the models embrace delta C, and the two others embrace delta W, and there were no clear reason for that at all. So one thing, as I said, this is more like a survey and evaluation, seeing what is proposed by previous things. But one thing that was very obvious was, why not unify those two things? Delta C, delta W have complementary strengths. One is looking for the immediate relevance, the other is more holistic. So why don't you use both? And you can. And given a motif with M events, you should select the ratio of delta C to delta W in a proper way. Again, this is kind of trivial, but if you put delta C greater than or equal to delta W, this is kind of meaningless. In that case, delta C just becomes redundant because delta W is the real constraint there. And that's why this, if the ratio is greater than 1, that means you only use delta W, shown as a third case in the constraints. And also, ignoring the delta W, just delta C itself brings an implicit bound for the window, which is the delta C times n minus 1. This is the largest possible window size you can get. And if the delta W is larger, then it has no effect. So you want to make sure that delta C and delta W ratio should be in between this interval. So it will be between 1 over n minus 1 and 1. It is the only time both will make sense. Again, I'm showing a couple examples here for C, delta C6 and delta W10. The rightmost one is the only weighted one because we know the total difference is 10 and the consecutive differences are less than 6 for each consecutive pair of events. So I'm not doing good on time, but this is basically very high level thing to stress that for a given simple network like this and defined parameters like this, certain subgraphs are weighted according to some models and not weighted according to some others. So for instance, the second one, the 7, 9, and 15, this is only weighted with respect to the second model, but invalid for the others. And the reasons are it violates the delta C, or it is not an induced subgraph in the sense the Covenant et al. Considers. So it's quite possible that you have a large variety of what is a valid motif and what is not with respect to those four models. So for the evaluation, we consider this set of temporal networks. I think the common theme is the human communications in all of them. Either it's like the text messages between people or phone calls or online interactions by means of emails or Facebook or Stack Overflow. Those things are happening among the real things, among people. And it has a big impact. As I said, this bursty behavior of the human nature is pretty important in all of those networks. So we'll basically look at the two things, implications of these inducedness constraints and the impact of the timing parameters. We went up until 4 nodes and 4 events, which is even a bigger, has a bigger spectrum than the 36. I think it goes up until 418. And we see how are the counts and what happens when you vary a particular parameter. We also discuss a Neve lens, which makes things a little bit easier to talk about. Instead of treating each event or each thing as a single entity, we group like what happens if you just consider 2 events together if they share a node. And there are like 6 possibilities for that, shown here: repetition, or ping pong, or inburst if one receives 2, outbursts if it is the reverse, the convey, which is like a transitive thing, and the reverse of that is weakly connected. So this is like a 6-letter alphabet, more expressive, and it helps to capture cause-effect relationships. But most of the things I'm going to say cause-effect are just observations. So those are not intervened experiments, only the observations from the data. So for the inducedness, I'm only going to show this experiment, the consecutive events restriction. I remember it was the definition. If you want this motif, if you have this network, you don't allow 3 and 8 because there is that 5 that the middle vertex is supposed to be part of. So what we did is we counted the motifs by enforcing this consecutive events restriction and not enforcing consecutive events restriction. We'll look at the 3-node 3-event motifs only. There are 32 of those. And we check the rankings of the motifs and see how the rankings change when you enforce this consecutive event thing. And the result is kind of unexpected, to be honest, when we first do this. It made sense, of course, after a while, but when I remember first seeing this, it was pretty surprising. The thing is, certain motifs are amplified by this consecutive events restriction. And those motifs have a commonality that you can easily observe. So for all of those networks, you see the increases in the rankings. We are ranking 32 things, and we observe like ranking increasing like 23 ranks or the 18, 17. Those are like very big jumps. And those things only happen for those 4 motifs. And notice that the first and the third are in that ping pong shape. So the third event is always the reciprocal of the first. And by definition, the consecutive event restriction will favor that kind of things because of this restriction. And this basically created bias in the data. So we thought this shouldn't be considered at all, but there's like a clear favor for that 4 particular motifs when compared to the rest of 28. But this was the first result we had for the inducedness. So we had more in the paper. I'm just leaving that for now. The next thing was the timing. And as I said, what if you only use the delta W or only delta C or both, this unification thing. So we tested that. We set delta C over delta W is equal to 1/2, which basically means it's only delta V, or 1, which corresponds to third, or 2/3, which considers both at the same time. And the experiments were assuming the delta W was 3,000 seconds. And this itself was an interesting question. Given a temporal network, how do you choose delta C, delta W? And one common practice from the last model was looking at the mean of the inter-event times. I believe there's room for improvement there, and there can be more educated guesses, but we stick with that for the sake of this experiment. So the main result here was if you just allow delta W constraint and don't care about the delta C, it will yield more repetition, ping pong, inburst, and outburst things. So this was again creating some imbalance or some bias in terms of the motif frequencies you observe, and using both constraints that by setting the ratio as 2/3 seemed to be like a good compromise, giving a balance between those two extremes. Another thing was this intermediate events, which was overlooked in the previous works. So if you have 3 events, a natural question is, when does second event happen? Is it close to the first one or the third one, or how is the distribution? Likewise, if you have 4 events, when does this second or the third event happen? So that's what we checked here. So this top row of experiments this is just an example motif, but we observed those are more like representative, and other motifs show similar characteristic. So that the thing is, if the first and second are like repetition or ping pong, we are likely to see the second event very close to the first, as denoted by this chart, the only delta W. So the distribution is skewed to the left. Here I'm showing the first event occurring at the 0 percentile, third event in the 100 percentile, and the second event is basically denoted by those blue bars. This is the histogram. Ignoring delta W and only looking at the delta C gives you like a more regular thing where the first half is larger and the second half is less. And you can go again between those two extremes by varying the delta C over delta W ratio. This is something in between those two. Likewise, for this square thing, the college message network, note that here red has this inburst first and second, and the green has another inburst from third and fourth. So third is likely to happen to the fourth, and the second is likely to happen to the first. And that's what we see here. The blues are the second event, and the reds are the third event here, shown in the same way. Only delta W show this left and right skews clearly, which disappear here, and the other values bring some balance between those two different skewed and the regular distributions. So only delta W suffers from these skews, and the unification helps in this particular intermediate event analysis. The other side of the medallion is kind of what if you look at the motif time span. We put this upper bound, but we don't put any lower bound, and we don't know how many of the motifs just occur in 10 seconds if we define the delta W as 10 seconds, or maybe some of them finish way earlier. But that's what we checked here. The delta W puts an explicit bound for that, and delta C also does that, but in a more implicit way by this n-1 times delta C. And the histograms basically tells us the only delta C always gives you this normal distribution where the mean is the delta C, and the only delta W gives you more uniform things where the second part is kind of equally likely to happen across a larger span. And using both constraints again help to balance the extreme results in those two cases. So the last experiment, this is my favorite. We check this event pairs. As I said, defining things in terms of those are helpful. So we have this heat map 6x6 things, and you can map each of these cells as one of the 36 motifs I showed initially. The nice thing is any combination of these 6 things will give you a unique 3-node 3-edge event. It doesn't hold up if you go larger, but it's still a good descriptor. And looking at this heat map gives you some idea about which events are likelier to happen than the others, and also across networks, which networks show different similar characteristics and which do not. So here I'm only showing 4. Like first 2 are the SMS messages, the third is the calls, and this is the email. So looking at just the texture, the messaging networks have definitely exhibit similar behaviors. And I think we had the similar picture for the other SMS network. So this is something interesting in our opinion. It's like a broad way to classify networks by looking at the heat maps and putting a metric on that. We have been trying this candle tau comparison between the rankings, for instance. But there are also common things, like repetitions are very common. So in all the networks, repetitions are pretty frequent. And the weakly connected structures, which is denoted here, the reverse of transitive convey relation, is the rarest. It's always occurred as the least frequent thing. Another interesting observation we had was there are some asymmetrical trends, which kind of tell the story about how an information is being spread. For instance, if you have the convey as the first event, first pair, which are all shown on the y-axis, the conveys are usually followed by the outburst, but not by inburst. So if the information is worth to be conveyed, it is also likely to be broadcasted. That was the observation we had. If you look at the row C, you see the outburst is always darker than the inburst in all networks. Another thing was the inburst followed by the convey. So if you receive a message from multiple people, then it is something you likely to convey to someone else, and which is not shown as the this row, the inburst followed by the conveys, but not by the outburst, for instance. So the C cell is always darker for those two in the messaging networks. So before finishing up, I want to briefly tell the ongoing work. The question was great, asking about what is the statistical significance, and this is a very important question. There was a recent archive, I think it's not recent, but this survey paper basically considers all the proposed randomized reference models for temporal networks, counterparts for the configuration model or the ER model that you observe for the static ones. And Penkang, one of my PhD students, is working on that right now. But the problem is there is no clear model that we can use for this. There are so many different variants. You can, given a temporal network, you can randomize the structure of that, or the timestamps, or the both. For instance, this LS stands for the link shuffling. So you keep the timestamp of each edge same, but you just shuffle things around. And it basically destroys everything. It is very hard to observe similar picture as you did in the real counts. Another model was this IS, which always gives very similar things because it is very conservative. What it does is basically you look at the inter-event times that are for the adjacent events of a node, and if there are multiple, you just change their values. And this most of the time does not change much. We are still looking at which model helps best for our case, and most of the time the answer is application specific. So what do you want to see for that particular network if you are looking for this phone call data or the messaging data? But this is an ongoing thing that we are still looking for. We are also working on this Mercury data. Mercury is online marketplace, Japan-based. I think they had some US investments as well, but it is not there anymore, I believe. So we got the data from them, and the main problem they are dealing is prevent the selling or the purchase or the of these prohibited items like the weapons, drugs, etc. And we are looking if the temporal motif profile like this heat map can tell us something about the fraud and the normal transactions. So the hardest thing is to find the transactions that are labeled as fraud, and we are lucky to have this data from Mercury. And so far, we observe like very clear difference between what is normal and what is fraud. But also, you can observe something even between different fraud classes. How people try to sell weapons versus how people try to sell drugs. So this was again an ongoing thing. And the last thing was this Venmo data. If you know, this Venmo is a person-to-person payment app, and interestingly, the default option is you let Venmo to release the data when you send the money to another person. And most of the people do not change that. And Venmo releases this data publicly. There were, as expected, a lot of reaction in terms of this privacy considerations, but they still release the data. So for the research purposes, by anonymizing everything else, we basically consider these financial transactions happening among the people and also access to the friendships. So it's like a multi-layer thing. One layer is the friendship, the second layer is the transactions, and looking at the dynamics, the interplay between how the friendships and the financial transactions actually play with each other. Something very recent, last week, we detected that the cycle motif, for instance, which doesn't make sense at all in a financial transaction. It was one person sending money to another, second doing the same to third, and third is going back to the first. And I assume that all of those three are happening in a 12-hour window. It shouldn't be there, and we expect it to be very rare. It was the rarest, but when we look at the particular transactions, we see some different explanations. You can put a message when you send the money, and we had access to those messages and emojis, etc. And a big part of those cycles were the gambling transactions. So people are playing gambling in real time, and apparently it's a thing to just send the money whenever you lose it or get the money whenever you get it. So we observe like the particular 5-6 people gambling with each other in a 10-hour window, keeping sending money to each other. It was something totally unexpected, I guess. But it was, I think, pretty interesting in terms of making sense what the cycle can be in such a context. So in conclusion, we had this survey for 4 models, and we are barely scratching the surface here, try to classify things, bring some kind of taxonomy to the considerations they have with respect to the various aspects of temporality. The main observation we had is this inducedness and timing constraints can yield biased motif counts and further can impose a bias in terms of what kind of motifs you find when you think about those intermediate events in the motif time span. And also this length of event pairs is something useful to make sense of the things. My gut feeling is people are trying to come up with these one-size-fits-all solutions, and this is already hard for static networks. And the variety is very large in the temporal context. Temporal networks are very different from each other, and looks like the application-specific models. If you want to design a temporal network motif model for only, like, the text messages, it seems more promising than coming up with more generic solution, I believe. As I said, the paper is available on archive. Thank you very much again for this opportunity. And if you have any questions or any comments, please reach email. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Erdem. So do we have any questions anyone wants to ask?
So I have a question about the algorithms you're using. So what's the scale of the data? So you mentioned the Venmo and the Mercari data. So what's the scale of that data? And I know even measuring triangles is challenging. So how are you doing this for temporal motifs?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for the size here, I'm only showing the number of events and the number of edges. So edges basically means the unique events. So the ratio of the events to edges is kind of telling how repeated things are. But for Venmo, we are working on 7 million transactions, and we can scale this. The existing algorithms and the things that we can do can be scaled to tens of millions of events for now. But one important thing is it is not only about the events, but also about the time span. So are you looking at the 1-year data or 10-year data? This makes a big difference because the rhythm of the data is kind of independent of the time span. In the financial transaction case, you are still interested in delta W as 1 day, even if it's a 1-year data, 1 month data, or 10-year thing. So what I try to say is the number of events itself is not enough to denote the scale of the data. And we are trying to come up with some optimizations. If the time span of the data is large or if it is small, how can we make things run in a faster way? But so far, we can scale things up to like tens of millions of events. And in this group,
exact counts, and are you doing this like on a supercomputer, or how are you able to?
We are only working on sequential and exact count for now. There are a lot of opportunities for parallelism. I hope George looks at that and come up with some good parallel algorithms we can use. There have been some recent improvements for sampling stuff, but we are just looking at the exact count for now.
Okay, so like for example, how long would it take to run on a 10 million event data set? Say it's a W 1 year, like you said.
Yeah, I think we can count. I don't have the exact runtime results here, but for like the largest Venmo data set we had, the counting of the 36 motifs takes like less than a couple hours.
Okay, interesting.
And there are opportunities for parallelizing things, especially in the shared memory, I guess.
So I mean, I'm sorry to harp on this, but I always thought it was a hard problem. So is this a simple algorithm, or is there something going on here?
So okay, the thing is, this delta C, delta W parameter, it is a direct effect on that. If you define your delta W to be large, then you have to consider a lot of things. If it is small, then you consider less things. And this impacts runtime drastically.
Sure.
The value we choose was usually 3,000 seconds, I guess. Here. Here. So delta W was around 1 hour. And for this 1 hour thing, we could get the results in less than a couple hours. But if you are looking for a larger window, if the rhythm of the data is more in the days or the weeks, then it will take much more time.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have any other questions?
I have a question. I'm not in that area, so I ask a simple question. What's this evaluation done? For example, you test the emails, and you use like 45,000 engines. What does it? What's this experiment conducted? I cannot imagine. Did you prepare for 45,000 servers and send emails just like this?
So all of those are publicly available data sets. So we already have. We don't know who sends email to whom, but we know that from a particular node ID to another, email sent at a particular timestamp. So this is what we have. We have a list of timestamped events, and those are all publicly available. We have not collected any of those data ourselves.
Oh, then what's the main contribution of this paper?
This paper basically makes a survey and evaluates and compares different temporal network motif models and see what kind of impact those models have in their assumptions, how those assumptions impact the motif counts they give. And we observed some models favor certain motifs, and those timing parameters have also interesting impacts on the motif distributions, motif counts. So we basically tried to bring more like a comparative evaluation rather than proposing a new model.
Did you conduct any experiments yourself?
Those experiments we did ourselves. All of those experiments we did ourselves. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I have another question. I noticed that all the examples you gave were directed networks. Do these network motif models apply to undirected networks?
Yes, actually, undirected case is kind of easier. For 3 nodes, let me go back to that thing. For 3 nodes, you only have a triangle in the static case, and in the temporal case, the order of the things do not matter if nodes have no labels, etc. So, I mean, in any case, you will have 2 edges and a third will close it. So there is no variety. So edge directions create more variety and a harder problem. That's why we focus on this directed network. Another reason is most of the data is directed in the temporal context. If you send a message, if you call someone, if you interact with something, usually one party is the initiator, and there's that direction of the edge in the temporal dimension.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to ask something. At least looking at the slide you have up now, is there any consideration in the literature of much larger motif sizes than just, say, 3 vertices? Just thinking of like the Venmo example you were mentioning. I imagine for like a lot of fraud and transaction networks, this like, you know, the pattern is going to be a lot larger than just, you know, say 3 individuals and, you know, just a few transactions if they're actually trying to do something fraudulent and hide that within the larger, you know, transactional network that exists.
Some of the previous works look at the 4 nodes, and there are over 400 alternatives when you think 4 nodes and the directed events happening among them. And I think the main reason we are considering all of this is we don't know the motif of interest. We just try out. We believe that 3 nodes is enough to imply some significance, and we measure all and then see which one is more frequent than the others. And likewise for the 4 nodes and the events. if things get a little bit larger, it will be more like you have some template, which does not necessarily have a total ordering, but you want certain events to be happening before the others, and you don't define ordering for some others. And that's kind of where we want to go, by using these motifs, small things, to define these larger, more structured subgraphs, and trying to find those subgraphs in a given data to detect fraud, etc.
Yeah, I imagine like as you get larger, kind of punctorial explosion occurs.
Yeah, definitely. There is no way to like enumerate even. I don't know how many possible temporal motifs will appear if you think 5 nodes even. It's too much.
Do we have any final questions? All right, I'd like to thank Erdem one more time. It was an excellent talk. Thank you for giving it to us. And like everyone to have a nice afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.